Hi, everyone. This is Angel Borrelli, and welcome to Angel Borrelli Pitching, Season 11, Episode 9. And I'm here with my catcher extraordinaire, Jacob Courtney. How you doing, Jacob?
I'm doing good, Angel. Happy to be here again. Ready to get this going.
I know, and I miss you. You're off at school, but I love all that you have to say. And so, everyone, we have an interesting topic today, and I want Jacob to tell you how this topic came about. We were having one of our production phone calls deciding on what we're going to talk about and everything. And Jacob came to me with this idea and some questions. And Jacob, I'll let you tell them how this came about because this is such an important show today, thanks to you. So go ahead and tell everyone how this happened.
Yeah, so usually I work a lot with Angel and things will come up in our sessions and we'll start talking about it. And sometimes we'll get ideas for the podcast there, but we haven't worked together in about over a month now. And I've been away at school working with other pitchers, catching a lot of bullpens. And we had a talk the other day, like she said, and she asked me, is there anything that you've been seeing and you wanted to talk about? And now that I've been away from Angel, I haven't had anyone to talk about or ask questions about pitching. And so I really just wanted to share that with everyone. And I thought it would be a great idea. All the questions that I have and other pitchers have that I've been catching to share with Angel and for her to analyze it and give her knowledge for all of you guys.
Right. And they were specific questions about pitches, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah, like when pitches go wrong, like when this happens, the kinds of things that we could do in bullpens. I mean, bullpens are definitely, in the bullpens that I do with my pitchers, I'm definitely, I'm a pitching motion person. So I'm working with their mechanics, but the objective is that their mechanics serve the pitch. I mean, the pitch has to be good. And what we hope for is that they do it safely enough to where they don't get injured, but you can't ignore the pitches. And so when pitches aren't working, we have to come up with a solution. And actually the truth is that up until about 5 years ago, I would notice and I would know, of course, if the pitch was a strike or not. But 4 or 5 years ago, I became very interested, as does happen when you're around pitching. I mean, I've been around pitchers since 95, been working on the field with them since 2001. So this is a long time. And so you become interested in not just the motion for me, but what's happening around the plate. And of course, you have to do that to make sure the pitcher's happy. So there was a natural progression for me to become extremely interested in the pitches themselves, which, of course, as a researcher and an analytical kinesiologist, I'm looking at, hey, I want to know what the fingers are doing, what the wrist is doing. So I set about to do this intense research project 4 or 5 years ago. And over the last few seasons, I have mentioned things here and there about the fingers and the wrist and the hand, but it's really been coming together because I have some really excellent pitchers that come to me. And when they have a pitch that's not working right, or Jacob will say, hey, this is what's happening, they would look at me and I would think to myself, these are things I need to know. And so I started coming completely again from a muscular viewpoint and a kinesiological viewpoint, meaning the way movements are created. I would start to talk to the pitchers about their pitches, sometimes why they worked, why they didn't. And what we found, to my amazement, is that I was making adjustments to fingers, hands, grips, and things were working right. Right, Jacob?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it was kind of like an amazing thing. So my research has continued. And then a gift was bestowed upon me from above. I had a pitcher come to me 2 years ago. His name is Jake Baum. He's from Las Lomas High School. He decided before his freshman year that he wanted to play football, suffered a horrendous accident in a tackle, fractured his wrist bone, severed a nerve, and came to me after the surgery to get that healed with only 3 fingers working. His baby finger was completely null and void, half of the ring finger, because the nerve that the ring finger is fed by 2 different nerves. Half of it and the baby finger are fed by the same nerve, the ulnar nerve. And the father and the family came to me and we sat around and they said, we want to see if he can still pitch. And then we got started and things were going great. He had a second surgery. I'm not quite sure what that surgery was about. That's kind of over my pay grade. But he ended up having, I think, nothing really improved in the two fingers. But the surgery was to help something else that was going on in his hand. Anyway, the long story short is it rendered him with kind of a completely compromised hand. I think the thumb was somewhat improved, but he couldn't spread his fingers out. So if you put your hand down and just pull all five fingers apart, that's called abduction. He could not do that. And so, of course, when you're putting fingers on a ball, you have to be able to move the fingers around. So we became completely challenged. But this kid, Jake, is one of the most inspiring kids I've ever been around because never a moment did he not want to try or work for it. And so the reason why this is such a perfect topic and why when Jacob brought it to me, I wanted to talk about it is that after working with Jake and having to really understand the way his hand was compromised, what I learned, and this is what science says too. So there's, of course, a branch of science that does the biomechanics, what muscles, forces, blah, blah, blah. My side, which does the muscles. But then there's the neural side, where they really understand the way people learn patterns and the way we learn things. And my interest has always been to include that in everything I do. In fact, when I work with pitchers, I work through their brain to teach them about their body. I understand completely how movements are transferred to the motor control center. So, this kind of thickness to my knowledge, I was able to work with Jake from this perspective because he didn't have the fingers that were working. He had the mind that was working, though. He had the intent. He had the ability to be curious and to soak in information. And he also had the ability to contact his body and control it, even though he had no control over his fingers and certain parts of his grip. So this was a gift bestowed upon me. And Jacob, do you remember starting with him? I know you've been with me, but I think you were with me from the beginning with him, right?
Mhm.
And is it not amazing what he's done?
It's been an amazing improvement. I mean, coming in, I mean, he was told he wouldn't pitch again, and then we came in and we believed in him, and he believed in himself. And through your work, he's made amazing progress.
Yeah. So the reason why this is so timely, and I want to do a shout out to Jake, is that on this last week, he finally joined a team and he did a bullpen. It went great. And then he was in a scrimmage. Now, remember, he hasn't faced hitters and he hasn't been in a game setting or a scrimmage setting in over 2 years now because it was the summer before his freshman year. And so it's been almost 2 years now or a little bit over. And he threw 23 pitches to get five guys out. He had one walk of those five hitters, but still 23 pitches. And he was the only pitcher on the team that got a strikeout. I mean, he was literally taking command as a pitcher should. And what I love about the story is that the coaches, the way everybody stood around and was completely happy for him. And this is what I love about baseball. Through something awful like this, the main thing that was a concern to every coach is can this kid have his life back? And so my shout out to the Cal Rays for that. My shout out to Jake for being one of the most awesome people I've ever met in my life. And this is my take home message for everything. If something isn't working the way you want it to, the way you intend for it to work, you're doing something wrong. Don't give up. I don't care if it's with your motion or with the pitch itself. If your pitch is missing high, you did something. And the only way through situations of where you don't have pitch control is for you to do deliberate thinking, which requires deliberate knowledge about what is actually happening. So when I started working with my pitchers and their fingers and their grips, I would always discuss it with them from a muscular level, just like I would say, this is what the hip does here, and this is the muscle that's doing it, and this is where you need to feel it, and this is the amount of force you have to use. And I took the pitching motion and I took the pitches and started discussing it that way. First, to not confuse them, I'm not a pitching coach, but the pitching motion involves ball release. So it was just as okay for me to talk about the muscles, the fingers, etc., as it was for me to talk about the motion. So the story of Jake and everything we're going to talk about today is so important because I'm going to try to give you some of the tangible information so all of you coaches and all of your pitchers have just a few more pieces of information that you can share with a pitcher, because these guys get frustrated if something isn't sinking or it's not cutting or it's not dropping or it's going too high. They need to have some place for the solution. And more than ever these days, with all the data, if someone's telling you your pitch isn't breaking or it's not doing this or it's not doing that, there's so few places where someone can take that data and go, okay, so this is what we need to fix on your pitch. I don't like pitchers that have a pitch and they don't use it because they don't think it works. Jacob, do you see this frequently? You'll say, well, why aren't you throwing this? They'll say, oh, I'm not feeling it. It's not working. And I'm like, dude, we don't just like take that and go, oh, okay, we're not going to focus on that. I'm like, no, that's what we focus on.
I see that a lot, especially in your bullpens. A lot of people that are throwing, if something's not working, they'll just move on, but you kind of hammer it in until it works and find a way to make it work all the time. And that's the difference, I
Yes,
think, between good pitchers and great pitchers.
exactly. And that's why I don't like when data says don't throw this, do throw that. No, anytime data to scientists, we look at what isn't working sometimes because that gives us the greatest information. And as all of you know in the baseball world, you have the saying, everything works off the fastball. Well, guess what? There's more to that sentence. Everything works off the fastball, and each pitch relates to itself and teaches you something about the other pitches. So the more you work on a weakness, the more you learn something about your other pitches that are working well, and then you completely elevate yourself. So another saying that I love is you're only as good as your weakest link. And if it's your fingers, it's your motion, whatever it is, that's what you have to take on. So as we go into the fall season, it's so important that you highlight what isn't working and then have some information about it. All of you have the data now. Everybody's got the mechanical data that's saying this, that, the other about your pitches. But now let's back up and work a little bit. Let's learn a little bit about the places and some of the classic things for each pitch that are general knowledge things that you may or may not know, but the kinds of things that I can help digest for you and give it to you in a way that is simple to understand. So, Jacob, we were talking the other day, and one of in the when all this topic was born. Let's start talking about some of the things you asked me. So let's talk about your first pitch that you want to mention.
Yeah. So the first thing, I mean, like you said, when people say everything works off the fastball, I wanted to start with the fastball and talk about how the grip of the fastball can improve location, accuracy, spin, pretty much everything about the pitch starts with the grip.
Yes, it's a great place to start because some of the things that are involving other pitches, you can contrast with the fastball. So one of the first things that I think is important to understand. So let's talk about the things that happen with the fastball and as they relate to the knowledge that I have. So let's actually talk about the hand first, okay? Let's talk about things that you may not think about. The middle finger is the longest finger. So as the fastball is in your hand and it's kind of centered, and you have your fingers on top, two fingers on top, and you have a thumb on the bottom. We'll talk about that specifically in a second. So the ball is actually round and in your hand. So the fingers are gripping the ball, and it's the fingertips specifically. The wrist is controlling the way the ball is going to be released. And on a fastball release, we want the wrist to be what we call normal. It's fully pronated. If you put your hand down flat on a table, the hand is flat That's the way the wrist is. It's a fully pronated wrist. And that wrist is being controlled by muscles in your forearm. And I did, a few episodes back, exercises for this and how to understand this. So a fastball is released by using that very powerful straight up position of the wrist, because the wrist adds velocity to the ball. It's the last joint that does that. And so this is a very good pitch to start with in talking about it. And it's why it's the first pitch that's taught to everyone. Now, the things about the fastball, when I see a pitcher having trouble with it, I'm immediately saying, I ask Jacob, what did the ball do? And if the ball is, so the misses that happen with the fastball are missing high, missing in the dirt, and not having the correct spin. Is that correct, Jacob?
Yeah, that's correct.
Basic movements. Okay. So the first thing that we address is the miss that I see the most frequently is that the ball misses high. So here's what you want to understand, and this is true for every pitch. In the pitching motion, when you're creating your stride, as the arm is coming up to shoulder height, you're striding down the hill, your arm's coming up to shoulder height. That is when we have the most activity in the finger extensors that are actually hanging on to that ball. The fingers are in what we call extension, and we have the most activity in those muscles. So the ball has to be gripped in a certain way to make sure that at that time of the motion, you have a grip, a real grip on the ball. By the time the ball gets up and it's behind the pitcher's head, meaning he is now squared to the plate, and this is what's called the max external rotation position. It is the beginning of the acceleration path. So everybody picture this. You're behind the catcher, pitcher's facing you, shoulders up at 90 degrees. The elbow is bent to 90. His arm is laying back in that backward L position. In that place, the ball is got the firmest grip on it. And as I've told you before, it's 45 pounds. That's where you have the heaviest grip on the ball. At this time of the motion, the thumb is predominantly holding onto that ball and going to play the major role that happens next, which is where the errors occur when a ball flies out of the pitcher's hand. The thumb is a major player in controlling the movement of the ball as it does its next thing. It's sitting in the hand, it's furthest away from the hitter. The ball is facing the sky. Forces are bringing the hand downward into what we call in the wrist hyperextension. The pitcher starts accelerating forward. Now the ball is going to take a almost facing forward position, and the thumb is controlling which has the greatest friction on the ball. It's controlling the ball so that it doesn't roll up out of the hand too soon. So as the arm comes into the release position, which is the next position, we've got the ball in the back starting to accelerate. The ball starts rolling up. That grip on the ball goes from about 44 pounds to about 18 to 20, something like that. And as the ball starts to reach out for release, the fingers have to pull against the ball, and that's how it's creating the backspin. The middle finger's creating the direction, and it's able to do that because the ball is still in the hand. So we want the ball held long enough to where the hand can act on it. And the wrist is now in extension, and as it pulls, it's going downward. Now, if the grip behind the pitcher when he's facing, getting ready to accelerate, is not hanging onto the ball, if the thumb, and I know this very well because with Jake, we had a lot of thumb issues. If he's not hanging onto the ball enough, the ball would fly not only out of his hand, over Jacob, over the cage. Oh, I mean, it was like insane. And I said, wow. And then I would say, Jake, thumb, 44 pounds, grip that ball tighter than you think you have to. And boom, location. So my information to him, plus him as a pitcher knowing What does that mean, grip it tighter? Well, you don't grip it so tight. I trust him as a pitcher. You have to grip it tighter. Your thumb's important, blah, blah, blah. Next thing, he's got activity that's working. His ball is working. The ball rolling out of the hand too soon, that means the thumb not doing its job or the other fingers not gripping perfectly well around the ball rolling up doesn't stay elongated in the hand. The hand isn't elongated across it for long enough to pull against it. It rolls up as it's coming through. And when you look at this on camera, you can see the ball rolling up over the fingertips. It's like the fingers have no control. The ball goes upward, and that's how you get a high release to the ball. The other thing that's critical on a fastball, and I am shocked at how frequently, when pitchers come to me, I'm watching what they do. I don't start changing things until I see what they do. I film their mechanics, I watch them pitch, and I learn things. And I am shocked at the number of advanced pitchers that come to me that will be coming for velocity or location, or maybe they have an injury. And I say, show me your grip, and they'll hold it out, and I'll see their fingers spread apart on the top of the ball. We know that, and this is all science. The further the fingers are apart on top, the slower the ball's going to go. So the fingers together at the top of the ball, the thumb right underneath is perfect because remember, I just said you have to hold on to that ball with 44, 45 pounds when you're in max external. As it comes through, you got to control that ball from rolling up with the thumb. If your fingers are apart or your thumb is not underneath the ball, it's rolled up to the inside. So let's talk about a right handed pitcher. The thumb's underneath. And if the clock is facing the pitcher, he's got his thumb down at 6, right? If he moves that thumb up to 7, 8, or 9, that ball's going to be off center. The thumb can't do its job because he's trying to release with the straight wrist, and the ball's going to roll up. And it's amazing to me how many pitchers have a slight degree of misplacement of their thumb and also misplacement of their fingers. And the problem we had with Jake is his fingers were just moving. In fact, they tend to move on their own because, as I mentioned, there's certain things he can't do. And just from pitching, he has to really focus to keep the fingers where they're at. So I know for a fact that if the fingers move out, and if he was doing it because his fingers were allowing it, I can tell you, pitchers, especially young pitchers, getting sloppy with the grip, you can tell them put the fingers together, and the next thing they're moving apart, and the next thing the ball's going slower. They're not holding on to the ball correctly, so the ball rolls up. So the biggest issue with a fastball is understanding how you have to take care of that ball and actually work with it. And there is a difference. Science says the longer you hang on to the ball, the better, faster it's going to go. We don't mean hang on to it like you're pushing it. We mean grip it with the fingers so they do their job, because remember, at the very end of the motion, you're going to have to pull against the seams. And this is another thing. If you look at your fingers, that first knuckle that's below the fingernail, that knuckle is very important because it's the finger is pulling and flexing against the ball. And there is a neurological pattern and timing that researchers have said pitchers have with the timing of how their fingers open and close around that ball. And for each pitcher, you have to look at where he's at on the seam. So pitching coaches don't just assume they're handling those seams correctly. I've seen pitchers who have it right under the knuckle. I've seen some who have the seams under the fingertip, under the nail. And what you want to do is ask the pitcher if he's doing that and if that works for him, and have him experiment with that. Because depending on the length of each pitcher's fingers, it could be either placement. So those sorts of things, fingers together, thumb underneath, holding onto the ball long enough so that you can act on it, so the wrist can move the fingers. The other thing that's so important is understanding that when your hand is perfectly balanced like that, your knuckles the knuckles are where the knuckles and the knuckle that's closest to your knuckles, the knuckle on the finger that's closest to the knuckles, that's where the ball uncouples from. That's the first place where when you move your wrist to pull your fingertips, the ball separates from the hand there. And depending on what type of pitch you're throwing, if you uncouple that ball correctly from those two knuckles, you're going to have control over the direction of that ball. Just like when you have a different type of pitch, you're going to uncouple from a different set of knuckles. So it's very important on a fastball that you remember the middle finger. I always tell the guys, imagine your middle finger running right up into your forearm, and it does. And keep them together, thumb underneath. And that's how you keep control over the fastball. If it's high, it's rolling up too soon. And I think that that information goes a long way. And always trust the pitcher that he knows exactly what to do once you give him that information. Does that make sense, Jacob?
Definitely.
Have you looked at any of the grips of pitchers and seen variations?
I've seen definitely variations, especially with the fastball, because I mean, there's four seams, two seams, but especially with the four seams, I've seen people, even myself, before I started working with you, I used to spread my fingers because that's how I was taught when I was a little kid. It was easier to throw because I had smaller hands. But now that I can really grip the ball with my fingers together on right on the seams, what I learned from you, my spin, throws, getting on top of the ball, backspin, everything has been great.
Great. And by the way, I should have said this. I'm talking about a forcing fastball. Also, by the way, just to remind all of you, I only work with what we call in science overarm pitchers. What that means is the shoulder internally rotates to bring the hand forward. So if a pitcher is a sidearm pitcher, let's say we're looking at a clock, you're standing on the mound looking at a clock. If his release point is at 2 o'clock or anything lower than that, and I guess you guys call it that mysterious term 3/4, which I still never understand what that means. But 3/4 sidearm submarine, all of what I'm saying goes away. It may not go away, but I don't know anything about it. When I see a pitcher with that release point, if that's a release point he wants and it's intentional, then I can't work with them because believe it or not, the body works completely differently and it's not my expertise. So this is for what I just said, a four seam fastball. It may apply to two seam as well. I'm talking right now about a four seam and also a release point that is where you would call the balls either at, somewhere around 1 o'clock, 1:30, where we can see that the shoulder and the hand are out front, not to the side when he releases the ball. So what else was there? Was there something else about the fastball? Oh, I know what I wanted to say. And for all the things I'm going to talk about today, that you just want to understand about your fingers is that it is imperative that when pitchers arrive at the field, you find some way of having them work with their wrist and hand and fingers only. Now, if you own my book, you'll see a wrist flip in there, and I have two ways that we do it. I actually only use one of the two ways most of the time, but the good thing about having a pitcher work with all his pitches with just the hand and the wrist. So that would be, for example, you ask the catcher to get down. He gets to the field. This is his first drill. He's about 10 feet away and he holds his arm out in front. He takes his left arm, if he's a righty, and supports the arm at 90 degrees, gets his grip, bends his elbow to 90, and then boom, from the elbow to the wrist, he straightens it. And there's another way to do it where the arm is at 90. You don't straighten the elbow and you just do the wrist. We do that and we run through all the pitches. And Jacob is responsible for telling me if the spin was right and if it did what it was supposed to do. If a pitcher cannot handle the pitch, or if there's something wrong with the grip, you will notice it right then and there. So that when he adds the body, the pitch is going to really be bad. So by isolating the wrist, not only do you get to see, and you as a coach who know way more than me about grips, etc., you can go and make adjustments. And when the pitch is right there, then okay, we've got that down. Now, if he gets to the mound and it's not working, then you know that some part of his motion didn't move the fingers, but it changed the way his forearm came through the delivery. And then you know that it's the pitching motion that caused the problem, not the grip in the fingers itself. But pitchers have to understand the fingers, the grip, and the way the hand works and the way the ball moves through the hand, or they can't work with the actual skill, which is throwing the ball. Remember, the pitching motion is designed to allow the pitcher to get in the best position with the greatest amount of force so he can throw a ball. So throwing the ball is critical. And Jacob, you know what I mean, right? Because we always start like that.
Exactly. And I also wanted to say some of our pitchers will in the middle of their throwing like a pen, if their slider especially slider or changeup isn't working, they'll come up to that distance again and just do wrist flicks to try to feel that grip, and then they'll go back to pitching after.
Yes, it's a great idea to know how to isolate it. So I want to say some specific things about pitches, but what was the next pitch you wanted to talk about?
The next pitch I wanted to talk about was an interaction I had the other day with the changeup,
Okay.
and talking about because a lot of pitchers think if they just grab the changeup with a lot of fingers that it'll naturally move and slow down. But learning from you, I know you've talked about how the changeup, the speed difference and the movement, or not so much the movement, the speed difference comes from the wrist and choking the ball deep in your hand. And I wanted you to kind of explain that a little more.
Okay, yeah, and that brings up another thing about what baseball talks about. I think pitchers get confused, and you may also, as the listeners, you coaches out there, may be confused when I was talking about that the grip has to have 45 pounds of pressure. And you might be saying, no, we teach our guys to hold it in their fingertips real lightly and blah, blah, blah. And the changeup is specifically because, when I was in graduate school, I'm always doing research. They wouldn't let us use any pitching coach books. But I was so curious. I was reading real books from pitching coaches and talking to coaches. I wanted to get knowledge from both sides, even though we couldn't use it in a paper or a project. But I do know the lingo, and I know that especially for a changeup, it's like hold the ball in your fingertips, and I think they would say like you're throwing an egg, which I'm like, oh my, thinking when I think about force. So there has to be an amount of force for every pitch where you're able to have your fingertips do what they do. But I think where pitchers get mixed up, and it's why sometimes I say squeeze the ball as hard as you can and just throw it. I'm not saying you're going to pitch this way, but squeeze it harder. When my eye is drawn to a guy who's holding on to the ball in such a way that it just looks funny. If my eye is pulled to the hand, and I'm looking at hands all day long every day, I go, something looks funny. Do me a favor, squeeze the ball harder, grab it more. And I see activity, and then he throws the ball. And then I'm like, okay, somewhere between what you were doing and there is the right thing. So I think pitchers get mixed up about the fingertips, which is most predominant in problems with changeups. But the biggest thing about a changeup, which I learned when I was in graduate school talking to one of my advisors, Dr. Evans, who was was a pitcher for the Yankees in the minor league system. And we were talking about the pitches, things that, of course, I wasn't doing in my classes. And he and I were talking in his office, and he was teaching me about the changeup. And the changeup, the reason why the changeup goes slower, because just to revert for a second, we know we never want the arm speed to change. But when pitchers know they're throwing a pitch that's supposed to be slower, their brain gets, because they don't have the information, their brain goes, I guess I should throw it slower. So their arm speed slows down. And this is one big error in changeups when you see it not making it across the plate. So number one error with the changeup, the pitcher slows his arm speed down and then it doesn't do anything. It can't make it across the plate. Well, that's the pitcher who doesn't understand that. No, you have the full blown speed, arm speed of your fastball. But the reason why the ball goes slower is because you've changed the length of the lever with which you're throwing the ball. So the fastball, the reason why you want it on the fingertips, not to be confused with not gripping it. Okay. No, I'm not a fan of the egg analogy, but you want the ball is further out in your hand. Your fingertips are around the top. The lever goes from the fingertips to the wrist. And if you move your wrist up and down, that's the end of the lever. And so you've got the lever from the wrist all the way to the tips. It's just like using driver to hit off the tee. Okay. It's the longest club. The longest club is the wrist to the fingertips. You take the change up, you put it back into the hand all the way back. The fingers are now over the top, and the wrist to the fingertips becomes completely a different length lever. And what it also does then, and the chicken or the egg, people say your wrist doesn't move the same way with the change up. Well, it doesn't move the same way because the ball is back in the palm of your hand. So the wrist can't move the same way. See, you have room. In other words, if you bend your wrist and you've got a big block in it, you can maybe only bend a little bit. If you take and just put an egg in it, then you could bend it more. So with the ball being back, it controls the wrist flexion. So the position of the ball in the hand controls the wrist joint, which contributes velocity. So we're cutting down on that. And you're also changing it because you're changing the lever length. So the deal with the changeup is to hold the ball back in your hand, and then that changes the speed. So you can say to a pitcher then, no, trust your grip. Trust that the grip changes everything, which I say is true for every pitch. The grip changes everything. So understanding that allows the pitcher to eliminate the biggest flaw for a changeup, which is that he's throwing it in the dirt. And of course, our other fix for that, Jacob, is that I back you up around 6 feet behind the plate and I make the pitcher throw it hard enough to get across the plate, right? Do you remember that? And
Mm-hmm.
then you back up to right behind the plate where you normally are, and he's able to
Exactly.
get across the plate. So the pitcher has to be able to throw the ball hard enough. And while all this sounds like elementary stuff, you wouldn't believe the number of pitchers out there that I've seen have the perfect grip, but it's way out in their fingertips. And when they get it back in their hand, they fall in love immediately. So this isn't anything that I'm making up. This is what is. And now, could there be changeups that aren't held like this? Absolutely. I'm sure there are. I'm sure that there are pitchers that do things with their hands and fingers that we couldn't even imagine. And I know this from working with Jake because he does amazing things with the ball given his circumstances. But generally speaking, these are the issues that you want to deal with the changeup. Does that make sense to you, Jacob?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So what's next? Are we talking sliders?
I believe so. I wanted to talk to you about sliders coming out or being shown too early because I had an incident the other day during a bullpen where I could see the slider right when the pitcher gets square. I can see him bringing his arm in, reaching as far as he can back to try to like snap his slider. But when I hear you teach sliders, I hear you say that you want to, it's pretty much a fastball all the way until release besides the grip. And then I just wanted to hear your take on that, like the misconceptions and what happens with mistakes on sliders most likely.
Okay. So the most common thing, and in fact it's the main thing. In fact, I'm trying to think if I've ever seen anything other than this that causes a problem. But let's put it this way. This is always present. So the interesting thing about the slider when I was looking at it from a mechanics viewpoint, from a baseball viewpoint, but also the mechanics of the axis of rotation, because the slider it has an axis that's almost diagonal to the side, and then there's an axis that comes more like you're pronating. It has kind of a dual axis. And when you think about this, you want the ball to carry like a fastball and then cut to the side. So you're asking a ball to carry like a fastball, but to break to the side, meaning it's going to slow down and it's also going to drop. So you've got an interesting thing that's happening. You want it to do two things. So your hand has to do two things, meaning your wrist has to do two things. Now, here again is the lesson that I've always known, but was cemented in my head working with Jake. What the pitcher is thinking is more important than what he might know or think he's doing or what he's doing. A pitcher has to think appropriately about what's happening. And that is why I like information to pitchers, because they can take it and they can run with it. So when pitchers are thinking about that they're releasing more like on this diagonal axis to the right, meaning they're almost releasing the outer third of the ball first, which means they're uncoupling from the outside of their knuckles. The knuckles that are more to the outside, they uncouple from there first than they do from the inside. That thing in their head starts getting them going. The brain is way ahead of what you're thinking. No, actually, what I said it wrong. The brain is ahead of what you're doing because it monitors what you're thinking and then it knows what muscles to fire. It's firing, it's getting the muscles ready to fire before you actually do anything. And this happens all day long with every movement you make. It has to be that way, or we would be stuck in space, trying to make movements all day. So it's very important that pitchers understand that they have to get behind the ball in a very specific way to allow this dual axis release to happen. Now, one of the major movement errors in pitching is not having the correct shoulder action. So pitchers a lot of them tend not to directly accelerate the ball from the shoulder, but they get caught with this late arm, either at stride foot contact or as they're rotating, and they lead with the elbow. And what you saw this pitcher doing is squaring up, and the ball wasn't ready to go. You saw it near his head, right?
Yeah.
And because of gravity, and because of that, the gravity's pulling on that forearm that's laying behind him horizontally, right above his shoulder line. When you even allow that to position to happen a little, gravity pulls on that. So now we've got a pitcher with a ball near his ear. And let's say we've got the pitcher. This is deadly for any pitch, but it's very deadly for a slider. So if a pitcher has this problem and he's got that slider grip, he's coming around and he's got this grip and he's got his ball near his ear, he has no choice but to lead with the elbow. Now, when you bring the elbow forward, which then brings the ball into perfect alignment to throw, if you look at your hand, your forearm has rotated. And I've covered this before also. The problem with leading with the elbow is your forearm rotates, meaning the hand that's holding the ball is now changed in space. Your fingers haven't moved, the ball didn't move, but it changes position in space. In other words, if there's something written on the ball that is facing the catcher, it's all of a sudden now facing the pitcher's head. Okay, so the forearm rotates as you bring the elbow through first. Because of the grip of the slider and the way the thumb on a slider is just the way a fastball thumb is right-handed, is right underneath the ball. And I'm a thumb fanatic because I did a lot of research on the thumb and I find it intriguing because no one ever thinks about the thumb. So I wanted to think about it. The thumb on the slider is moved towards the pinky finger. It's not down the center. It's a little bit crossing the center. So when you have that configuration, and the thumb's the strongest finger on the arm, and you have that configuration, and then you have rotated your forearm incorrectly as you're pulling through. And if you do that in the air, imagining that thumb position, believe me, that thumb is working in a muscular way. And now you're caught. It's very hard to repronate the hand to get behind the ball like you can do easily with a fastball. In fact, it's why A lot of baseball pitchers have forearm problems because they come through leading with the elbow. Their whole ball is facing sideways as if they're going to throw a curveball. They know automatically to repronate the hand to release it, and they can sometimes be great pitchers. Problem is their forearm gets fatigued. Next thing they're having Tommy John. With a slider, they're trying to make that correction. They get caught underneath the ball, and now they're making the correction. They're almost having to release the ball to release the strain in the hand. And then the slider does whatever the heck it's going to do. Not break the way you want. It's not going to have the movement you want. It could have any variation of problems. But the problem is that leading with the elbow, you can create a fix for that with most pitches, definitely with a curveball. You can definitely create a last minute fix with a fastball. It is problematic for injury prevention, but if you're throwing strikes, you probably won't care about it. I care about it. But the slider is unforgiving. So if a pitcher is leading with the elbow, so if you have a guy who's a good pitcher and he's throwing a slider and there's something strange to it, what you want to do is say, is he a guy that leads with the elbow? And if he is, he's probably not a slider guy, unless you can get him to change his shoulder mechanics, which, depending on his level and depending on your level of ability, he will love making that change for all his pitches. But that is the number one reason that a slider goes wrong. Does that make sense? And this, again, I'm speaking physiologically and on a muscular level. The thumb is not a finger you want to mess with. What do you think?
No, yeah, I think that's a very good fact. I mean, the thumb is very important, and I know you've talked about how all the fingers are important in their own way. Like the pinky was even important, and I had no idea when in hitting and throwing. And I think it's just through research and looking at the body instead of pitching as a whole thing, looking at, like you said, the motion. I think it changes all of pitching.
Exactly. So, Jacob, did I cover the main questions you had about those three pitches?
Yeah, I think so. I love the way you talked about it and analyzed each pitch, and you gave some great information. I think that everyone should listen to and use in their daily pens and pitching.
Okay, so just to review some basic knowledge you want to have about your hand. First of all, the thumb is the strongest muscle of the hand. It has the most friction on the ball. Where the thumb is placed, if it's placed off center, the ball is going to move off center. If it's underneath the ball, you're doing a fastball, it's going to go straighter. And also remember that the most important thing to releasing a ball correctly is how the ball is held in the hand at the beginning of the acceleration path. You have the max external rotation position. The ball is in the hand. It begins the acceleration path. The thumb controls mostly that grip, which is the strongest grip of the entire motion. If something is off there, the ball will not be held in the hand long enough. I don't care what pitch it is. And when you go to release it with your fancy fingers, etc., you're not going to be able to act on the ball with the fingers that you want. So that's one thing to remember. Remember that the middle finger is the longest finger. So it is the direction finger, particularly for a fastball. And we all know it is the topspin finger on a curveball because it goes around the top of the ball. Also remember that the ball has to come out of the hand, and the way that is the way you're throwing the ball. So if you're uncoupling from, and let's call it the knuckles, that's easier to see and to understand. The knuckles start to separate from the ball as the wrist starts to come into its extension and before it goes into flexion. And depending on if you're releasing it straight or on an angle, you want to understand the way the ball is being removed from the hand at the level of the knuckles. So in a fastball, you're removing, lifting the knuckles right behind the ball. And on a slider, for example, it's on the outer third. And that taking that connection of the ball in the hand is critical. And again, when we talk about the ball in the hand, we know the further back the ball is in the hand, the slower the ball is going to go. And this is something to look for with kids because sometimes they will hold their fastball too far back, and that's when it has no speed. So just like we want it in for a changeup, you want to make sure it's not in on a fastball. So did I summarize it and make sense, or did I confuse everything? Everything good, Jacob?
No, I think the last summary was great. I think you did good.
Okay, awesome. So listen, we're coming to the end of the season. We have one more podcast next month. I'll make sure that I cover some topics related to off-season, but thank you so much for listening. You can contact me at angel@gymscience.com. Please see my Angel Borrelli Pitching website, and be sure and email me if you have any questions or concerns, okay? And I'll talk to you soon.